Just 1 second. The session is open.
Great. Hi everyone, we're just waiting, giving another minute as we see that many people are still joining. And as the clock changes to 15:03, we will start. All right, which is now. So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining our research webinar. We have a great topic for a discussion on Friday, which is the economic impacts and the regulation of AI. Not an unusual topic these days, a lot of us talking about it. And my name is Paweł Gmyrek. I'm a senior researcher at the research department of the ILO, and I'll be moderating this session. We have two great presenters whom I will introduce in a moment, but let me start with some housekeeping for the start of the session. So first of all, we've put a link, a direct link in the chat. So if any of people you know who registered and had any problems accessing the session, they can use that link. You can send it to them. The session is scheduled to last 1 hour. And during that time, about 45 minutes will be taken by our discussion between the three of us, and then we will open for questions from the floor. Now at the ILO, we discuss often how it is up to us to choose how we apply technology. And I will apply that philosophy to our session when it comes to video conferencing tools. So we would like this to basically replace meetings in person or feel like it, to be a discussion. So if you have a question at the end of the session, if you raise your hand and you want to switch on your camera and ask it and talk to us, I will give priority to those questions. And otherwise, if you have a very compelling reason for which you cannot do it this way, then we will look at the chat later. Maybe use the Q&A box so that we have all the questions actually in one place rather than the chat. And that's it in terms of logistics. So let me present our guests today. Mariarosaria Comunale, she's an economist at the IMF in the research department of the IMF. And prior to that, she was the Principal Research Economist at the Bank of Lithuania. She also worked at the ECB and at the Austrian National Bank. And her main area of research pertains to applied international macroeconomics, artificial intelligence, innovation, monetary policy, growth, and inequality. She published her works in several journals, and she has a Ph.D. in money and finance from the University of Rome. And Andrea Manera has an equally impressive profile. He's an economist at the European Department at the IMF. And his research is focused on the role of capital flows and FDI in promoting growth and innovation, and on the potential effects of AI on labor markets and productivity. Previously, he worked and published on automation, innovation, and labor market reforms, and he also worked as an analyst in the research department at Goldman Sachs International. Andrea has a Ph.D. in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And we met recently in DC with Mariarosaria and Andrea when we were presenting some of our work there, but also had a discussion after we read their paper, which we thought was very useful for people working on research related to AI. If you're looking for references to your paper, that is one place to find all the latest literature. But also it was useful in framing to people who maybe don't have the time to read all of this literature, how researchers have been thinking about it and what we know. And that's why we thought that this session would be great to hold, to organize, and have a discussion so that we can basically benefit from your knowledge today and everything you've put together on paper. And maybe as a starting sort of warm-up question, can you tell us about AI? Like, what do we mean as AI in 2024? Because there are many definitions out there. And in your literature, I found that you break it down very nicely into different types and also different timelines of how we've been thinking about AI and how research has been writing about it.
Thank you,
So let me
Paweł.
share the slides.
Yeah, you want to I can share also, so I can move the.
Andrea?
Oh, yes, I saw
Okay.
that you had shared it, so I got
It's all right.
confused. All right. Yeah, so thank you, Paul, for the very kind introduction. So here I have this, we have this definition from one of the founders of artificial intelligence. McCarthy was a professor at Stanford, and he defined AI as the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. Of course, this is a very broad concept which encompasses a number of different applications. And in particular, as economists, what we have been most interested in, and what the literature has focused on, has been the field of machine learning, which is a subfield of artificial intelligence, and that is the science effectively of learning patterns from data. And this field includes another subfield that is deep learning, which can essentially specialize in learning more complex patterns. And this subfield, and also in a way evolution in part of the broader machine learning, paved the way for a further innovation, which is the most recent and the one that probably caught the eye of all the audiences worldwide, which is generative AI. And this generative AI is this subfield of artificial intelligence, which can generate content that is hardly distinguishable from human content. And a particular subset of generative AI is given by large language models, of which ChatGPT is probably the most prominent example. And of course, others are, for example, image and video generation. These ChatGPT is mostly, these large language models are usually mostly focused on language generation, but they have also been integrated with the others. So it's interesting that since we first produced this diagram, things have somehow changed a little bit as well. But importantly for today's talk, while this is the latest wave, so generative AI, which also a number of studies have tried to assess, we don't have as of yet a lot of evidence because the technology is very new. So if we have some empirical studies that we will discuss, for example, on firm level outcomes resulting from adoption of machine learning, these usually result from a previous wave of machine learning, and therefore do not encompass the most recent generative AI, for which we have still limited evidence, and usually we have some amount of extrapolation, I would say, from previous estimates. So I would think this is the taxonomy that we found useful when thinking about this problem, and we will come back to it. So usually when I refer to generative AI, I refer to studies that focus on this part, and machine learning more broadly refers to studies that exclude generative AI, and this is a distinction we also have in the paper.
That is great, and that is very helpful. And of course, anyone who used generative AI that we have contact with, so ChatGPT or alike, if you drafted a letter in a foreign language, you did something like that, or if you read some of the recent experimental literature, you realize that there are those big promises of very isolated cases, but promises of productivity. And of course, for the audience at the ALO, but also probably for all of us working on the topic, there are those two parts to it. One is how will this technology and how does AI more broadly that you described interact with labor markets? How do economists think about it? How do you interact with jobs? And what are the different models that I found you describe in a very helpful way in your paper? And then there is this question of the bigger economic impact. How will that potentially higher productivity actually translate to the bigger economic picture? How will that affect inequality, wages? Of course, all these things that economists always try to model. So would you give us maybe a walk over that, how you basically see that picture shaping up in the paper that you wrote?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So all the topics that you have mentioned in a way are overlapping and intertwined. So it's useful to start and try to frame of what is the macroeconomics of AI. And yeah, the title of this slide is borrowed from a paper by Acemoglu, who tried to do a first quantification of what could be the effect of AI on aggregate GDP and productivity. So what is the simple macroeconomics? This simplicity, I suppose, comes from the fact that you can obtain sort of very simple closed forms, but it's not fully simple in the sense that we have multiple and countervailing effects when we are thinking about AI. In particular, the way that economists have thought so far about AI is in the context of models that have been developed to study automation, also by Acemoglu and Restrepo, which is the task framework. So output is produced as through the fulfillment of different tasks that have to be executed. So, for example, to make a T-shirt, you have to cut the cloth and then sew the cloth and so forth. And so these different tasks can be assigned to either workers or machines. And by machines, one can think of robots, but equally more important and relevant for today, AI. And this assignment, since it's done by profit maximizing firms, will be based on the lowest unit cost. So the progress of automation and the progress of AI is seen as an improvement in the productivity of AI, which is in a way what we have seen. So now we can generate all this text, for example, which we couldn't do before, and not so easily at least. And the net effect on overall employment and the labor share as a consequence will depend on how the tasks are allocated given this improvement in productivity. So if AI becomes all of a sudden more productive in doing some tasks, these tasks could be reassigned to machine instead of workers. And so this, of course, will create a pressure on demand for labor and a reduction in the demand for labor. However, on the other hand, if the task is not reassigned to the machine but is still done by humans, the other tasks that have been substituted by AI are now done more productively, and therefore the productivity in the remaining tasks that are still assigned to labor increases. And this increase in productivity raises the demand for labor. So in a general equilibrium setting, these two forces will interact. And this is what will determine the final effect. So in a way, it's not really possible to think separately of the effect of labor market and on productivity because the two are inherently connected. And this framework has been used, as I was mentioning, by Acemoglu and also by another paper from the IMF, in particular this staff discussion note, where they use the calibration approach with an heterogeneous agent version to understand the overall impact on inequality after considering both labor market and productivity improvement. In terms of model, there's also this other paper that is a bit different and doesn't strictly follow this setting, but it's something that I like to include because they have a different classification where they explicitly separate which tasks are complemented and substituted, which is less explicit in these other frameworks. So if you're interested, look at our paper and we discuss this a little bit more. So given this discussion, what inputs would we need to assess what is the overall impact on the labor market? And to understand that, we need essentially these four inputs. So first of all, we need to know how many tasks are at risk of substitution. So how many tasks can AI do better than humans in different occupation and demographic groups? But importantly, we also need to know whether it is economically profitable to substitute workers, because of course, if AI can become better and can do similar tasks, but if it's still more expensive than a worker, firms would not deploy AI. Then we would need to know what are the cost savings that we can achieve by using AI other than workers in specific tasks. And why this is important is because this will drive the productivity effects that can be achieved, because these cost savings are essentially with less resources, right? We can produce a certain amount of output. And so this will give us the productivity effect, and we will need this for different tasks, for the different tasks. And then we also would need to know whether there is a potential for augmentation in some of these tasks. So not in all tasks that AI can carry out, we should expect AI to substitute humans, but there can be also some tasks in which it's just used as a complement. And finally, in order to fully account for those general equilibrium effects that raise labor demand, we would also need to know what is the response of other factors of production, for example, other forms of capital that are not AI. However, there is somehow a gap in what we can get from the literature, and then we can go into details in how these different components has been computed and estimated. But I wanted to highlight from the beginning what are the gaps and why some of these results from the literature are not fully suitable yet to assess AI, and which is something that we discuss more in the paper. The first thing that we get is we get a percentage of tasks that are exposed to AI. So the literature used these terms of exposure to mean which tasks are tasks that are similar to what AI can do. So for example, if we think of somebody who has to do a lot of, for example, translation work, which is something that AI can do very well, the literature would say that translators are exposed to AI, but it is unclear whether, for example, translators would use AI to just do the easiest translation task and then have to spend more time by making the more complex choices relative to words, or if they would be completely replaced. So again, it's in this case we don't have a distinction between complementarity and substitution in many of these studies. And in general, there is a big gap in evaluating what is the profitability of actually deploying AI. And there is just one study, as far as I know, that looked at this, which is this Svanberg and co-author, where, however, they only looked at a subset of technologies because they focus on machine vision. And here they actually assess how many of these overall exposed tasks are actually profitable to substitute with AI. Then we have some limited productivity estimates, and this is, I think, a big gap in our knowledge, because we have some experiment on generative AI that are related to specific contexts, and we will see which ones they are very soon. Or we have some firm studies, which, however, as I was mentioning at the beginning, are related to technology before generative AI. So they cannot fully quantify what is the impact of the current state of AI, which also include these generative models. And then, as I was mentioning, complementarity is not sure. And when it comes to investment, this is something that we don't know very much about, and it has to be inferred from previous studies, for example, related to automation. And the issue and the state of the literature, due to the fact that these inputs do not correspond exactly with what I was citing in the previous slide, is that there is a wide range of estimates and a wide range of different assumptions that can be made, starting even from the same number. So even if we start from a certain amount of exposed tasks, one has to choose how many are profitable to replace, how many are complemented, what could be some productivity estimates, and therefore we have a wide disagreement in the literature in what will be the overall effect. And I will get to this number at the end for added suspense, but I'm happy also to discuss the different choices that are in the context of this paper by Asimov. So starting from, that was kind of the thematic organization of the literature and in terms of the inputs that we need. So now let's see how actually the literature has tackled estimating these different impacts. So first of all, when it comes to the strict labor market impact, and this was generally not done in a general equilibrium framework, there has been this computation of task exposures that I have already discussed in a way, and it's a percentage of tasks substituted by AI. Then, as mentioned, there are empirical studies on firm vacancies and other outcomes referred to the pre-generative AI, and then some experiments on generative AI. And these are the ones that looked at labor productivity more narrowly. While when it comes to the productivity and growth impact, we have, as I was mentioning, a larger gap in knowledge. So there have been some theory papers which all highlight a potential for growth explosion. So this is what sort of underlying the optimism that we have seen in some estimates of overall productivity and GDP. But at the same time, when it comes to actually giving a number that is grounded in something that has been estimated, we usually have to rely on extrapolation from exposure measures and experiments. So like multiplying the exposure by the productivity even in experiments, or extrapolating from some also firm level studies. So starting from tax exposure, what has the literature found? What we see is that there's a very pervasive exposure. So there are many tasks in the economy where AI could potentially replace human because it can do similar tasks. And this has been estimated to 5 to 25% of overall employment. And when it comes to exposure, which again does not distinguish between substitution and complementation, we can see that high-skilled, high-pay, and non-routine workers are the ones that seem to be more exposed. However, there is the big question of complementarity. So one paper by some other IMF researchers tried to correct for complementarity using the exposure measure. And in general, there is more potential for substitution than complementarity, according to their estimates. However, for example, Pavel and co-authors find something that is in a way a bit opposite, and their approach is based on looking at how much is the exposure of each different occupation and and understanding what is the variability of this exposure as a measure of how much the AI could actually complement or substitute. And in fact, in this case, it seems that augmentation might be more pervasive than substitution. So we know that it will affect labor, but it is still not fully clear in which direction. When it comes to actual firm level studies, which are referred to pre-generative AI, all these studies tend to find that there is an expansion in employment and higher wages to worker with AI roles, which is something that we might expect because this is the type of workers that will clearly directly benefit from AI, but there is an uncertainty when it comes to the distributional impact. So some studies find that there is actually a contraction in the employment or wages of non-AI workers. So this would point to some type of substitution and increasing inequality. But others find different cases, or in particular in the OECD case studies, which are quite interesting. What they find is that even if there is displacement, usually workers are reallocated to other tasks. So they do not really lose their jobs. And perhaps in these other tasks, they could also reap some positive productivity effects. So the evidence also here is a bit more mixed, but it might point to more inequality in some cases. And finally, when it comes to experiments, and which are focused, however, on the latest wave, so are not directly comparable to what I just shown, usually there is an evidence of increasing productivity. But again, as I was mentioning, it's related to specific tasks, which are probably also the ones that are more suitable for AI. So in particular, they looked at call centers, a case where actually it was convenient to deploy. So it was a case where firms had decided to introduce generative AI, and they assessed that the increase in productivity here can be up to 14%. Or for example, Noi and Zhang used in an experimental setting and looked at writing tasks, which are also probably very suitable for AI. However, there is also a bit of a caveat. This paper is very interesting from Agarwal and co-authors, where they show that even though, for example, radiologists could be complemented ex ante in a way, because AI is actually really good at understanding some features in radiology. However, humans tend to prefer their own judgment, and so they ignore the suggestions and thus do not really get complemented. So there is also a question of implementation. So finally, what would be the productivity impact when it comes to actually getting an aggregate number? And so here, as I was mentioning, theory predicts a growth explosion, because the idea is that AI is very helpful for research, which is something that we might have, all of us might have noticed by like brainstorming or finding some initial idea, or even like literally accessing knowledge, which might be really specialized sometimes. And so the idea here would be that R&D, which is the force for growth in most of the growth models of the latest generation, would yield a much higher productivity, because the idea generation would be faster. And so this would create, according to this estimate by Bailey and co-authors, a 33 higher productivity in 20 years. So something like 1.5 per annum. And there is some evidence in firm level studies, again, pre-generative AI, that AI adoption does increase innovation. But it's unclear that this really results in productivity improvement, again, when it comes to pre-generative AI. So we would, of course, need to understand whether the latest wave also has these features. Then there are some private sector estimates, which also started from this exposure measure and from the productivity estimates from these experimental studies. And interestingly, they reach similar numbers with a different approach, because while they have a lower bound that is 0.1 percentage point per year, they also have an upper bound of 1.5, which would correspond with these other more optimistic estimates. However, as I was saying, there are a lot of choices that are involved in reaching this number. So Acemoglu, this instead estimates 0.7 percentage point, but not per each year, but over the total of 10 years. So this would be more closer to the lower bound. And of course, this is just another testament to the fact that we have very high uncertainty that has still not been resolved. So I think that would conclude my answer on this topic, and I'm happy to go into the choices probably later if we have some time. We can look into that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's such a comprehensive overview, and we could spend probably the rest of the session talking about the economic side, but you still have the other part, which is regulations. But maybe just a quick stop for you, because I don't think you mentioned that much of the differentiated effects among high-income economies and developing countries. And maybe if you can give us a quick update on that, how it's covered in the literature, that could also be helpful.
Yeah, certainly. So when it comes to the difference between advanced and emerging economies, we have, of course, an important sort of difference, which is due to the sectoral composition. So again, and it's also still based on these exposure measures. So if we have a lack of evidence coming to advanced economies, there is even larger lack of evidence when it comes to emerging markets. But the finding is usually that different sectoral composition and different task composition attenuates what are the labor market effects in terms of direct displacement. And again, if we think of just using this exposure measure. However, these differences might mask some other features that set apart emerging markets and advanced economies, because usually it's not the good jobs or the bad jobs are not really the same across the two markets, and we could get higher wage relative to the rest of the population in jobs that we might consider relatively unskilled in advanced economy. And also there is an uneven demographic impact. For example, Powell find that, and his co-authors find that young and female workers seems to be more affected in emerging markets. So it's important also to take into account these other aspects, which might be very important, for example, in cases where female labor force participation is already low, for example. And in the terms of productivity and also larger spillover effect, there are also important differences. So first of all, the productivity impact may be quite large, because if we think that if indeed AI turns out to be able to substitute higher skilled workers, this could make up for example, gaps in human capital that may be more pervasive in emerging markets or also even lower income countries. So this could actually be a very positive productivity effect. And similarly, this could even create improvements in terms of trade, because if AI substitute relatively more high-skilled labor, then economies that have more low-skilled and resource-intensive economies could actually end up benefiting, because they are more sheltered from this type of substitution. However, the opposite might be true if AI is more complementing. So again, there is this big uncertainty. And a last point that is also perhaps quite interesting is that there will also be an effect on capital flows, which is very important, because recently we have seen some movement towards a retrenchment of capital flows, also away from some lower income countries. And if AI, since advanced economies are more prone to adopt AI, this could also divert capital flows towards advanced economies. And this is an insight that comes from this paper by Alonso and co-authors.
That's great. And I think we have to just put a little pause now on the economic side, because we, of course, at the ALO especially, have a large part of audience that is very much interested in the second part of your paper, which is about regulations. And what you do in the paper, I found it very interesting, because not only do you cover concrete country cases that you discuss in detail, but you also discuss the philosophy, the theory behind regulation, and how divergent it is across different countries. So I found that overview helpful, and if you can tell us about both, so those country cases, but also how regulators decide to approach it in terms of their philosophy behind it, that would be, I think, very interesting as an opening of the discussion that we can have at the end.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Thank you, Ailo, for having us. And I hope you can see the slides about regulation right now. So thanks again for this question. I mean, regulation on AI specifically is very much ongoing. There are some regulation that can be applied to AI, but what we want to stress in the paper and what we are going to present now, and replying to your question, is how AI-specific regulation have been developed and been shaping in the very recent months. So the debate on challenges of AI regulation are basically covering three main aspects. What and if to regulate. So you can regulate models or you can regulate outcomes. So it depends also which part of the AI chain you want to regulate. The speed of regulation. So there are in some situation, you need more time to structure a regulation and becoming a law of the country compared to the speed of technology, which much more faster than the speed of regulation. And how to regulate. You want to have a new governance or not, or using the governance you already have. So there are all these, they are the main three aspects that we have been found in the debate about AI regulation. On the top of that, there are different goals and reasons to regulate, and we will go through them a little bit more in depth afterwards. One main point I think we found across the regulatory systems we have seen is there is no consensus of the definition of AI regulation. OECD, gladly, they are keeping track of definition of AI through regulations, but we will see also in a final table that both the coverage is different across the regulation, is also how they define AI system models, it can be different across them. On the top of all these challenges, the rules are hard to settle because AI is rapidly evolving. So let me give you an example. So the AI regulation ongoing in the European Union, called the EU AI Act, started from a proposal by the EU Commission in 2021, year in which we didn't have an idea of generative AI, right? So the definition of AI evolved with the evolution of the technology as well. There is not much in the theory of regulation right now. This part of the literature is very much in infancy, but let me just report a couple of papers, which is Acemoglu, Lensman, and Guerreiro, that they basically concluded the opera regulation is when gradual adoption is made. So you have like not fully adoption at the same time when the technology is out, and or a beta testing and learning what can be possible risk and possible drawbacks. And it's also important for developers to be liable for negative effects. This comes with another major question that we ask ourselves looking at the regulation. I think that the people making the regulation, they're asking themselves too, is shall we look and regulate ex ante, looking at possible risks of AI system, AI models, and having an ex post liability approach in which you make these developers paying some penalty or having some sanctions afterwards, after the risk actually manifested. So let me see if I can, okay. Oh, that went fully on another side. Sorry, there's a lot of spoilers we don't want you to see for the time being. Okay, so I was talking about the different goals and reasons to regulate. So let's get into this a little bit more specifically. So what's the major regulation we will touch upon, they covered are these aspects. So the main one, more economic one, if you want, is market competition. So market competition in AI world can be based on the source of market power, in the increased concentration in sector using AI, and in price discrimination. So it's really depending on which part of the AI chain we are talking about. If we are talking about a market competition or market concentration and monopoly in creating semiconductor can be one aspect, or developing a model, or you are a firm and you are using AI, you're using for price discrimination or to a better position in your own market. So market competition really depends which type of segment we are looking at. But this is one aspect that AI regulation can touch upon. The second one is privacy and copyright issues. We will see that privacy is actually included in most of the regulation we have seen, while copyright issues is for the time being mostly left to a decision by courts. And they can be very different in this aspect as well. The third one is regulation on AI touching on strategic issues, national security, military uses. They will very much depend on the legislative system and the system of the country we are seeing. Sometimes you cannot have a regulation that goes into military uses if your system is sovereign-national, like the EU. The fourth one is ethical bias concern, because the outcomes from your using of AI, your using of generative AI can be inherently biased because the developers didn't think about it, the information, the data testing you have been using for your model, they are embedded some bias concern. So this is one aspect also AI regulation has in some form. The fourth one is also more like economic financial, let's say, is financial stability. So some uses of generative AI in AI models can bring some problems related to financial stability, both as cyber attacks or as herd behaviors on steroids, let's call it like this. The fifth point here, the financial stability, is the one a little bit less covered by the regulations we have seen in the paper. So let me give you a sense with very, in real life examples. So you're also asking me what are the differences in different approaches, right? So the first one is what we call ex-ante risk assessment. As I mentioned before, some of the regulation look at the possible or likely risks in some AI systems. And this is the approach that has been followed by the EU and Brazil. Even if very recently Brazil is drafting a new text, getting a little bit more into like being more flexible in regulating AI, but still these ex-ante risk bands or risk categories, they are still there. So yeah, these approaches and these regulations are very much evolving as we speak. The US, we look only at US regulation in the sense that US overall, there can be regulation at the state level. We don't look at them for the time being in the paper. But the main document that the US released in 2023 was an executive order on AI. This is a more decentralized approach. They give guidelines and they indeed decentralize the release of documents or further guidelines to agencies or ministries. Then we have the approach of China, which is mostly based on algorithm recommendations. So as I mentioned, what to regulate? They regulate the models at the very beginning, so the algorithm. And also has a very ethical, heavy importance in the regulation. So there is ethical reviews based on the core values of the country. Getting more into the pro-innovation flexible approaches, the UK has a context-based view. So we have a white paper with some guidelines as well. And just recently, the government replied to these guidelines and these points raised in the white paper, but is not a regulation by the mean of like being binding and regulating with penalties or sanctions. So it's going more into like the flexible pro-innovation territory, which is the choice that have been taken by Japan and India. It is for now. India has a debate going on this, but for the time being, both countries, they maintain a flexible view on AI. So just summarizing what I said about the reason to regulate and the different approaches, indeed, financial stability aspects are limited, and we will see like a summary table just afterwards. Most of these regulations we look at, they include monopoly aspects, ethical aspects, and privacy risks. On national security, I was mentioning that really depends on the situation, right? The US, they do cover national security explicitly. But some other entities like the EU, they are more ambiguous because of their structure, their own legislative system. So some aspects, they cannot be covered by common EU laws, but they are left to national legislation. On copyrights of AI-generated products, we have some example of US and China with very different decisions from the courts. So it's like less left to these laws or the regulatory system, more like a decision from the court based on already applied laws on copyrights, more general laws on copyright, not AI specific. But what I really would like to stress, we want to stress that in most cases, these regulations are either still to be decided, adopted, or applied. So the main one, if you want, the first one, the ex-ante assessment one, the EU AI Act, still is not EU law yet, but the text has been approved by all the institutions, and also they had the core agenda. So probably the text will not change, but as soon as they will become EU law, they will take 2 years to be fully applied. So again, there is also a matter of the speed of technology compared to the speed of regulation. This is the summary of AI-specific regulation. So if you want to have a takeaway about this section of the paper, I think this table and the note can be useful for you. So we looked more in depth in the paper at 3 cases, the EU, the US, and China. and with their latest document, AI-specific regulation. Again, we cover only EU-wide regulation, which is the EU AI Act, and not the country-specific regulation. There can be also those. And for the US, we don't look at the state-specific. So this is like at the national level, supranational level. And then we have the interim measure for China. So the approaches are different, indeed, ex ante versus the centralized, just guidelines, principle and priorities, so not very binding, and then this ethical model design and content checks and ex post liability for China. The coverage is different, the definition of AI is different. EU looks at AI application, general purpose AI, they divide it in high risk and systemic models and integrated into AI systems. So it's very like structured and very, they can be differentiated in the type of AI that we are looking at. The US look at AI and AI models and dual use foundation models. So the language is also different, right? There can be some similarities, as you can see also in the notes, but the definitions are a little different and the names are a little different. I want to stress China specifically, they only regulate the use of public generative AI. So whatever is not public usages of generative AI, is not included in the interim measures. So almost everybody look at competition, privacy, ethical, copyright, the US they cover, but is mainly left to courts, and financial stability is mostly left to the general regulation, not AI specific, but in the case of US, we have cyber security in the executive order. And military, we covered it as well. So I think for the specific regulation, that's it from my side.
Great, thank you so much for this overview. And of course, that lack of consensus on AI definition is why I wanted to start a discussion asking you how you define it in your paper as well. And it's interesting in the overview telling you're showing us how labor regulations are basically not that visible in the sea of considerations that you have been mentioning here. You mentioned these country cases, but this also has, of course, global implications. So there are some multilateral efforts, and I think you also looked into that in terms of regulatory multilateral efforts. And I also have a follow-up question that I found an interesting part of your paper, which is those considerations about research gaps. Of course, that is the core function of any literature review. So if you could tell us a little bit about it, about the disconnect that you were talking about between researchers and policymakers. But of course, from our point of view, as ILO, what do you think are the gaps where we could add value based on your review of literature, where most focus of research could go from our end and sort of satisfy the need or the gaps? And I see no one has raised their hand so far, but if there are colleagues who would like to ask questions, then after this answer, we will go to you. We already have Luis on the line as the first one to go.
Yeah, let me just answer to your questions very quickly, and then we open up, I think, for further questions. So there are indeed some actions in the multilateral realm and about cooperation. They started way back in 2019. The OECD published some AI principles, which again, they has been updated very recently, including more of an aspect of generative purpose AI, generative AI, but also touching upon safety and information integrity, which was not completely embedded in the first cases. G7 is very active in having a forum to talk about AI, both with this international code of conduct that was released in October, but also with the new presidency of Italy this year. In November 2023, there was the AI Safety Summit by the UK, which tried to make an international effort understanding the risks of AI. In March this year, there has been the Council of Europe AI Convention on human rights, democracy, rule of law. So less of an economic aspect, but more on these sides. There is a UN resolution on safe and secure trustworthy AI, again on the human rights and inclusive access to AI. And even more recently, the UK and the US had the first bilateral agreements on how to evaluate safety. So most of these actions, these multilateral actions, are maybe less on the economic side and more on the safety side, understanding the risk of the frontier, AI, democracy, and human rights. But the OECD principles, they start including a little bit more on the economic side. But the main efforts are not on that direction, I might say. For specifically on labor market, so one economic aspect, there is not much in the regulation we are looking at. So this is what is covered in the EU and US. There is just like some points, number 92, about the EU Act, that there are some guidelines concerning information and consultation requirements for employees in case AI is being used in their work. Similarly, the Department of Labor has been delegated to issue issuance on a similar case. So the employers need to know if AI is monitored or used in their work. And for the US executive order, they also mentioned some guidelines that need to be structured and developed about supporting American workers, attract talents, and foster innovation. Apart from these two aspects here, there is no more, but we want to stress that there is a potential role of something else. So apart from regulation, but the role of unions and labor standards can be also an important point to raise. We have like recently an example in the US where AI was included in the labor deal, and it was a subject of bargaining. So it was not aimed to ban AI or the use of AI, but there was more a demand to share the productivity gains from AI. So this can be something that probably IDO audience and yourself could find very interesting. And we had also a very interesting discussion about that with yourself and Janine when you were here. So I think this is a part of the literature, a part of regulation that can be very important also to bridge regulation and what Andrea was presenting on the impact on labor market and productivity. So getting to the very final part of your question, what are the open issues? The first one is the lack of consensus of AI automation effects. So Andrea pointed out quite extensively that the effects are still quite uncertain. We want really to stress that there is a lack of data, especially task level, sectoral level productivity data. So if yourself at ILO or other colleagues, for instance, in the OECD, they have new data, updated data, more granular data, they will help really understanding the potential of AI in the positive and a negative sense. As I was mentioning, one point is also the difference between regulation and the speed of technology advancements. So there is a little bit of a clash of getting, into the latest stage of AI and all the possible risks. There can be new risks that the regulation in place they don't cover yet. So probably there is a need to be a little bit more flexible in what to cover in a regulation. And there is a lack of analysis on this side on the effect of regulation on firms and sectors. So going back to the idea that granular data will be very much welcome. And I concluded like this. So if you want to discuss any of these points more thoroughly, just let us know.
Great. I mean, of course, we're taking note of your recommendation about the role of the unions and labor standards in collective negotiation and discussing the share of the benefits of these technologies. That's of course two IMF economists highlighting that to us. So I have a recording of that as proof.
Usual disclaimer applies here. Those are our views, not the IMF views.
Yes, of course. And I have three colleagues who raised their hands. And as I said, I will prioritize those three colleagues. We don't have much time left. So try to be quick. Let's go in this order: Luis, Balint, and Dibs, in the order in which you raise your hands. And then we have to keep in mind that there will not be that much time. Probably the session could have been longer, but okay. let's try.
Okay, thank you, Pavel, for the webinar, and thank you for the lecture you have given and sharing the article. Very interesting. I have a question to Andrea. I want to know his view. He said that it's very difficult to assess the percentage of tasks that in a specific profession or job that can be replaced or even complement. So it's complicated also to say for a journalist, for an editor, which task or which percentage of that job will be complemented or replaced. And I would like to know, because there are a lot of benchmarks among different tools, large language model compete each other from a company point of view, but all those benchmarks are like neutral. So they say how accurate they are, how they can solve abstract problems. But I don't envisage in the future a company saying, we want to have a benchmark and say that our tool can replace 90% of the task of this job. This is not something that the companies are going to do because it's scary for the people. So I would like to know, how can we better assess in reality, not just how ChatGPT can solve this mathematical problem, but how well can replace or complement a specific task? Do you envisage some kind of benchmark, independent benchmark, something like that? Thank you.
Maybe Balint?
Yes, thank you. Thanks. It's a really interesting webinar. I have a question on the speed mismatch you mentioned between the technology development and the law. And my question is that, is there a chance that law ever will be effective? Or it's more like a situation we see fighting against dopings in the Olympics game, that you only can regulate the AI which was developed 3 years ago, but it's nothing related anymore to the reality out there. Thanks.
If I may, it's a very interesting presentation. I wanted to know if you found anything in the literature on the impacts of this massive focus and investment on AI, and of course the Gen AI, in terms of inequality between countries. Like, will it deepen systematic inequalities in terms of the developing economies and underdeveloped, and can regulations help them? And also, in a situation where data is being concentrated in particular corporations in the West, what it means for regulators to regulate in terms of data privacy, and whether it will deepen systematic inequalities within and between countries.
Okay, we have very little time left, so let me add to the challenge. I'll pick up one question from a colleague who couldn't use the Q&A and who is asking about basically that firms and workers seems to be still figuring out how to use this technology, and there isn't much on training workers how to use it. And if you have seen studies that compare the AI adoption with the adoption of prior technologies, such as the PC and internet, of course, in that context of training of workers how to use technologies. I don't know in which order you want to respond. I know you have to go, Andrea.
Maybe Andrea can now.
Okay. Yeah. Let me start from the first question. I think it's very interesting, and I think it's a big element of disconnect between, in a way, the private sector and the policy. Because if we had this type of benchmark of what is the substitution or complementation, then it could also be possible to, in a way, steer the direction of technology. This is something that, for example, Acemoglu is very sympathetic with. In fact, something that is also interesting outside of the substitution and complementation is generally, and probably would also benefit the companies in a sense, would be to actually produce some type of productivity estimates with their model, depending on different tasks that can be done, which would probably also help them sell their products. And it would be very helpful also for research, because, as I was mentioning, this productivity is probably something that we know the least about, because substitution and complementation, I think, is really hard to assess the extent in some ways, because there's multiple uses. But yeah, I would say that productivity is probably a key, and then one could assess whether that increase in productivity is worth going through the substitution. And this is like another argument for inefficiency of automation if this productivity gain is not that strong, and it's something that we have in a paper also with Acemoglu about the US tax system, which we have a reference to in the paper. So if you're interested there, we have this discussion on productivity. And I think that would be number one thing to know. And I think another question that I can partially answer about training. So I mean, as I was mentioning, there was this paper that was looking at this complementation effect that was missing, these Agarwal and co-authors, which was very interesting. And I guess that there something that could be useful could be to show or inform workers about the different benchmarks and what are the expected gains, because sometimes something that can be, and something that I think if one does a bit of introspection you can easily find out, is also that we tend many times to also discount AI because we know that it's error prone, and maybe it doesn't get to the right specialized knowledge. But probably an important aspect of training is knowing how accurate it can actually be. And there is a paper that compares IT with AI. That is, we described that in the paper a little, this paper by Wang and yeah, so you can, I suggest you look that up if you're interested, but not in terms of overall productivity impact. Again, there isn't, I think, a comprehensive assessment of these two. And I think for the rest, I will defer to Mariarosaria because they're more productivity, regulation related, and I will also leave. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Andrea.
Bye-bye.
So we had a couple of questions about regulation. The first one is about the speed of regulation compared to the speed of tech. What I was explaining to you about the EU Act, that they started with a definition of AI that was different in 2021, and the latest version, which will eventually become EU law, gets into more like what we now understand about AI as a generative AI. But what is the beauty of it? They actually keep the definition quite flexible, so they can be like interpreted as a different type of like even more advanced AI. What we cannot know if in 2 years' time, when the EU law will be completely, in place and adopted, if there will be something completely even different with respect to what we have so far, and that we cannot anticipate. So the two possible ways will be either to have a definition of AI which can give you a room for possible developments in your law, or to have additional laws that keep track of AI. But again, it really depends on your legislative system. The EU is a little bit more, there has a little bit more length in the process because of it's a supranational system. Well, maybe both. Supranational system, and they need to follow some specific rules. And the adoption of a law and the structure of a law is very well defined, but it takes a little bit more time. It's quicker for country like the US and for sure countries like China to have a regulation out. So it really is national specific or country specific. Then we have another question about, I don't remember, sorry, there was another question on regulation, right? Do you remember, Pavel, perhaps? Or whoever asked, can you ask me again, please? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I mean, inequalities between wealthy countries, I mean, advanced economies, and what regulation, what role regulation can play.
Yeah, so there is, of course, this trade-off between regulating AI. So be sure that you don't incur into the possible major risk that AI can bring. But also, like on the other side, you want to foster innovation and attract capital to your country. So there is always this trade-off where you think about regulation, about risks and potential benefit. The potential benefit can be substantial, right? You can be the first mover, you can attract capitals in case you want to also like have some spillovers from innovation. But on the other side, the risks can be also quite substantial. So and there is all a bunch of literature about like existential risks concerning AI. So maybe the probability of this risk is like small, but there is such a thing. On the top of all this discussion, AI is a very international concept. You have externalities. You can have models developed in a country that can be applied on another country and sell to a third country. So it's international by design, I might say. So this is what also we said in the paper, that having a better like coordination and maybe a forum where also the economic aspects together with other aspects like ethics or privacy, they are discussed, will be very beneficial, because it's not something that will be confined within your border. Is really international by design. And this comes also with the inequality, right? Capital flows or regulation can also have effects on that.
Great. Well, we could probably discuss another hour here. We've covered a lot of ground today, but we are already 7 minutes past time, and then I will be judged as the moderator for making people overstay. I think the fact that many colleagues, we had about 75 people online and 55 are still with us, 51 currently, shows the interest that the session has generated. I, of course, invite participants to read your paper. And first of all, big thank you to you, Mariarosaria, and to Andrea.
I will pass.
Please pass him our appreciation. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you very much. And well, enjoy your weekend. You have a nice reading position for the weekend. And until next time.
Thank you so much, Pavel. Thank you for having us online at ILO. Hopefully next time in Geneva.
Next time live, for sure.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.